The stagecoach lurched violently to the left, groaning like a dying animal before slamming back down onto the rutted track. Inside, Eliza Hart gripped the leather strap hanging by the window until her knuckles turned the color of old parchment. Dust, fine and choking, sifted through the cracks in the door frame, coating the interior in a persistent red film that tasted of iron and dry earth. It was late in the summer of 1878. The Wyoming Territory was not a place that welcomed strangers gently. It battered them. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, breathless and scorching, pressing down on the endless sagebrush. When the driver finally hauled on the reins and shouted the team to a halt, the silence that followed was heavy. The town of Iron Ridge sat clustered in a depression of the land, a collection of raw lumber buildings that looked as if they had been nailed together in a panic against the wind. Men in worn hats and coats, stiff with grease, leaned against the hitching rails, watching with predatory stillness. Stray dogs panted in the shade of the boardwalks, too exhausted to bark. Eliza stepped down. Her legs trembled, not just from the 3 weeks of brutal travel, but from a fear she had been swallowing since she left Philadelphia. She smoothed the front of her gray traveling dress. It was modest, high-collared, and durable, but the hem was thick with road dust, and the fabric under her arms was damp with sweat. In her hand, she clutched a small, battered carpet bag and a letter. Folded and refolded so many times the paper had begun to tear along the creases. The letter was from Mr. Arthur Thorne. "My dear Miss Hart," it began, in a script that was precise and cramped. "I am a man of means and reputation, looking for a wife of breeding who understands the value of a quiet, Christian home." He was a shopkeeper. She had never seen his face. He was her last hope. As she walked toward the dry goods store, keeping her eyes fixed on the painted sign to avoid the stares of the men spitting tobacco juice into the dust, memories of the last year assaulted her. She remembered the sound of her father's weeping when the gambling debts were finally laid bare on the mahogany dining table. She remembered the cold stillness of the parlor when her fiancé, a man she had thought loved her, returned her ring without meeting her eyes. And most painful of all, the whispers. The day she had been seen walking in the park with Julian West, a man of questionable morals. They had only talked. She had not even taken his arm. But in the tight, suffocating circles of Philadelphia society, the debt and the broken engagement had turned a simple walk into a sordid tryst. Ruined. The matrons whispered behind their fans. Spoiled goods. Eliza pushed the door to the general store open, a bell jingling cheerfully above her head. A stark contrast to the churning nausea in her stomach. The interior smelled of coffee beans, sawdust, and cured leather. A man stood behind the counter, arranging tins of peaches with fussy precision. He was older than she expected, balding, with a soft, pale face that looked out of place in this harsh country. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice raspy from the dust. He turned. His eyes, watery and blue, swept over her. He took in the travel stains on her dress, the stray wisp of hair escaping her bonnet, and the desperate set of her shoulders. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a calculation. "Miss Hart," he said, "you are early." "I came as quickly as the stages would allow," she replied, stepping forward. "I trust you received my telegram from Cheyenne." Arthur Thorne wiped his hands on a pristine white apron. He did not come around the counter to greet her. Instead, he picked up a piece of paper from the counter, a letter, she realized, and held it up. "I received more than a telegram. Miss Hart, it seems news travels faster than coaches, even in these territories. A Mr. Wilkins arrived 2 days ago. He is from Philadelphia. He seems to know your family." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt. "He speaks of debts." Thorne continued, his voice rising, drawing the attention of 2 women examining bolts of calico near the back. "He speaks of a father who squandered a fortune on cards. And he speaks of a young woman who was found in compromising circumstances with a known scoundrel." "It is not true," Eliza whispered, though she knew the protest was useless. "The debts were my father's. The rest is gossip, vicious lies." Thorne slammed his hand down on the counter. The tins of peaches rattled. I run a respectable business. Miss Hart, I am a deacon in the church. I brought you here to be a helpmeet, a woman of virtue to raise my standing, not a scandal to drag it through the mud." The door behind Eliza opened, and more people drifted in, drawn by the raised voice. She could feel their eyes on her back, the burning curiosity of a town starved for entertainment. "Our agreement was based on your character," Thorne announced, looking past her to the audience he was now performing for. A crowd of 3 or 4 men and the 2 women were watching avidly. "Since that character has been proven false, the agreement is void. I will not marry you, Miss Hart. I will not have my name yoke-tied to a woman of loose morals." Eliza stood frozen. The humiliation was a physical blow, a sharp pain in her chest that made it hard to breathe. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I have nowhere else to go. I have spent the last of my money to get here." "That is hardly my concern," Thorne said, turning his back to her to adjust a jar of pickles. "You should have thought of that before you allowed yourself to be ruined." She turned and fled. She burst out onto the boardwalk, almost colliding with a tall man stepping out of the shadows. But she did not stop. She heard the laughter ripple out from the store behind her. The women were already whispering, their heads bent together like conspirators. "Did you hear? Ruined! A fallen woman! Here, in Iron Ridge." She found a room at a boarding house at the end of the street. It was a narrow, gray building that smelled of boiled cabbage and old sweat. The landlady, a woman with a mouth like a drawstring purse, took Eliza's last $3 and gave her a key to a room the size of a closet. That night, Eliza sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, her hands folded in her lap. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose pane of glass in the single window. Below, down the street, the saloon piano began to play, a tinny, frantic tune that drifted through the thin walls. She could hear shouting, the crash of glass, and the high-pitched, artificial laughter of the women who worked there. She pulled her knees to her chest and pressed her face into her skirts, fighting the tears. If she cried, she would break, and if she broke, she would die here. The next morning, the sky was a hard, indifferent blue. Eliza washed her face in the basin, put on her cleanest dress, though it was frayed at the cuffs, and went out to find work. She went to the hotel first. The manager, a man with grease in his mustache, looked her up and down with a sneer. "We do not hire women with your history," he said. The guests would talk. She went to the livery stable, hoping they might need someone to mend blankets or keep the office. The owner laughed in her face. She went to the small cafe near the depot. The woman behind the counter did not even let her speak. "We are a Christian establishment," she said, wiping a rag across the wood. "We do not want trouble." By noon, Eliza was exhausted. The heat was rising, shimmering off the hard-packed earth of the street. She stood in the shadow of the bank, trying to count the pennies remaining in her reticule. It was not enough for another week of rent. It was barely enough for a meal. Across the street, at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open scrub, a wagon was parked. A man was loading sacks of flour and coils of wire into the bed. He was different from the men who loitered on the boardwalks. He moved with a deliberate, efficient economy, lifting heavy sacks as if they weighed nothing. He wore a canvas coat despite the heat, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. Eliza watched him, drawn by the solitude that seemed to hang around him like a cloak. A pair of women walked past Eliza, not acknowledging her, but speaking loud enough to be heard. "That is Caleb Rourke," one whispered. "Still coming into town, bold as you please." "You would think the shame would keep him on that mountain," the other replied. "After what happened to his family. They say he let them freeze." The first woman hissed. "His own mother and brother. Saved himself and let them die in that blizzard. And then killing that boy in the saloon last year. It was self-defense." The sheriff said, "Self-defense. My foot. He is a violent man. A cursed man." Eliza looked back at the rancher. He had paused, his hand resting on the flank of one of his horses. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and when he turned his head slightly, she saw a jagged white scar running along his jawline, disappearing into his collar. He looked up, and for a second, His eyes met hers across the dusty street. They were dark, guarded, and utterly devoid of hope. Then he turned back to his work. Hunger drove Eliza back to the general store. She needed bread, and perhaps she could plead with Mr. Thorne for a refund on the supplies he had promised to provide for the wedding. When she entered, the store was empty save for Thorne and the silent, brooding figure of Caleb Rourke, who stood near the back, examining a set of hinges. Thorne looked up, his face hardening. "I told you, Miss Hart. I have nothing to say to you. I am not asking for marriage, Mr. Thorne," Eliza said, holding her head high despite the trembling in her hands. "I am asking for decency. You promised to pay for my lodging for the first week. You promised to return fare if the arrangement did not suit. The arrangement did not suit because you are a fraud," Thorne snapped. "I owe you nothing. I have no money," she said, the desperation leaking into her voice. "I cannot leave. I cannot eat. Would you starve a woman because of a rumor?" Thorne sneered. "A woman of your talents need never starve. Miss Hart, I'm sure the saloon is hiring. They are always looking for fresh faces, however soiled they may be." The cruelty of the remark took Eliza's breath away. She stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. From the back of the store, there was a sharp clatter as a heavy iron hinge was set down on a wooden barrel with unnecessary force. Thorne's eyes darted to the back. Caleb Rourke was standing there, watching them. The rancher's face was unreadable, but his body was tense, coiled like a whip. He looked from the shopkeeper's smug face to Eliza's pale, stricken one. He saw the way her hands shook, the way she held herself together by sheer force of will. "Can I help you, Rourke?" Thorne asked, his voice suddenly nervous. Caleb did not answer. He just stared at Thorne for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze heavy and flat. Then he picked up his purchase, threw a few coins on the counter, hard silver dollars that rang out in the silence, and walked past Eliza. He did not speak to her, but as he passed, he paused. The scent of pine resin, horse sweat, and rain-soaked earth washed over her. He looked at her, and she saw not judgment, but a flicker of recognition. It was the look of a wolf that sees another wolf caught in a trap. Then he pushed out the door and was gone. Night fell, bringing a suffocating darkness to the town. The wind had changed, turning from a hot breeze to a damp, chilling gust that smelled of ozone. In the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. Caleb Rourke sat at a small table in the corner, his back to the wall. He nursed a glass of whiskey, listening to the room but not part of it. He rarely came to town, and when he did his business and left. But the storm was coming in fast. He could feel it in his bad knee, and he had decided to wait it out rather than risk the wagon on the pass in the dark. At the bar, two of his neighbor's ranch hands were laughing with a gambler in a silk vest. "Did you see her?" the gambler asked, spinning a coin on the bar top. "The little bird from the east." Thorne turned her out like a stray cat. "She will be in here by the end of the week," one of the hands said, wiping foam from his lip. "A woman like that, used to luxury. She will not last a day scrubbing floors. She will be looking for a warm bed soon enough. I hear she is experienced." The other hand leered. "Maybe I will offer her $1. Do you think she is worth $1? Caleb's hand tightened around his glass until he thought the heavy crystal might shatter. The anger was a cold, hard knot in his gut. He knew what it was to be the subject of their talk. He knew how they whispered about the blizzard, how they looked at him as if he carried death in his pockets. "Walk away," he told himself. "You cannot fight the whole world. Caleb, you tried that once, and a boy died." But the image of the woman in the store, her chin lifted, her eyes terrified but defiant, would not leave him. She was standing on a ledge, and the whole town was waiting to push her off. He downed the whiskey in one burn, stood up, and walked out. The silence that followed him was thick with hostility, but no one said a word to his face. Outside, the storm had broken. It was an early autumn fury, sudden and violent. The wind howled down the main street, driving sheets of freezing rain before it. The dust of the road turned instantly to a slurry of thick, sucking mud. Lanterns flickered in windows, struggling against the gloom. Eliza stood on the porch of the boarding house. The door was locked behind her. Mrs. Gable had met her at the entrance 10 minutes ago. "I cannot have you here," the landlady had said, her face pinched. "The other guests are complaining. They do not want a woman of your reputation under the same roof. It is not proper. But I have nowhere to go," Eliza had cried. "It is storming. Find a man to keep you. Then, Mrs. Gable had snapped, shoving Eliza's carpetbag into her chest. "That is what your kind does, isn't it? Now." Eliza stood shivering in the dark. The rain lashed at her, soaking her thin dress in seconds, plastering the fabric to her skin. The cold bit into her bones. Down the street, the lights of the saloon blurred through the downpour. It was warm in there. There was food, and there was the end of everything She stepped off the porch into the mud. The icy slime oozed over her boots. She began to walk, head bowed against the wind, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. She did not hear the wagon until it was right beside her. The horses snorted, their breath steaming in the cold air. The wagon creaked to a halt. Eliza looked up, wiping rain from her eyes. Caleb Rourke sat on the bench seat, his hat pulled low, water streaming from the brim in a steady curtain. He held the reins in gloved hands. He looked down at her, a dark shape against the storm. "You are going to freeze to death," he said. His voice was deep, rough like gravel, and barely audible over the wind. "I have nowhere to go," Eliza shouted back, her teeth chattering. "Get in! I have no money to pay you! I did not ask for money! Get in!" Eliza hesitated. She looked at the dark, empty street, then at the man. He was the one the town feared, the killer, the man who let his family die. But as she looked at him, she saw he had spread a heavy oilskin tarp over the seat next to him, keeping it dry. She handed him her bag, which he took easily. And then she climbed up. He reached out a hand to steady her, a quick, strong grip on her elbow, and pulled her onto the seat. He threw a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. It smelled of horses and tobacco, but it was warm. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, huddled under the wool. "There is nowhere in this town that will take you tonight," Caleb said, clicking his tongue to the horses. The wagon lurched forward, fighting the mud. "I am heading out to my place." "It is 10 miles. Eliza stared at him. "You cannot take me to your ranch. It would not be proper." Caleb let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh. "Look at you, Miss Hart. You are soaked, homeless, and the whole town already thinks you are a whore. I think we are past proper." The word hung in the air, brutal and true. Eliza shrank back into the blanket. They rode in silence for a long time. The only sounds, the drumming of the rain and the sucking of the wheels in the muck. The lights of the town faded behind them, swallowed by the dark. Eliza began to shake uncontrollably. The cold was seeping into her core. "I have no one," she whispered, the words torn from her by the dark. "My father is dead. My reputation is gone. I have nothing." Caleb did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the ears of the horses, his profile carved from granite. "I know," he said. He was silent for another mile. The isolation of the plains pressed in on them, vast and terrifying. "I have a ranch," Caleb said suddenly. His voice was flat, matter of fact. "It is good land, but it is too much for one man. The house is empty. It has been empty for a long time." Eliza watched him, waiting. "I need a wife," he continued, not looking at her. "The town, they talk. They make trouble for me because I am alone. They think a man alone is weak or dangerous. I need someone to manage the house, cook, keep the silence at bay." He paused, shifting the reins. "You need a name. You need protection. You need a place where no one can turn you out in the rain. Are you proposing marriage?" Eliza asked, her voice high and incredulous. "I am proposing a deal," Caleb said. "We marry. You take my name. You live in my house. I put food on the table and keep the wolves from the door. And what do you expect in return?" Eliza asked, her face burning in the cold. Caleb finally looked at her. The shadow of his hat brim hid his eyes, but she saw the scar on his jaw white against his skin. "I expect you to work hard. I expect you to be honest. That is all," Eliza swallowed. "And marital duties?" Caleb turned back to the road. "I sleep in the bunkhouse sometimes. Or I will take the small room. I am not looking for a lover. Miss Hart, I buried my heart 6 years ago in the snow. I am looking for a partner to survive this." He pulled the horses to a halt at a fork in the road. To the left, the road led back toward the town, toward the saloon and the shame. To the right, the track disappeared into the black emptiness of the hills. "I will not force you," he said. "If you want, I will turn around and drop you at the saloon. They will take you in." Eliza stared out at the harsh, empty landscape. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the jagged peaks of the mountains. It was a terrifying country, violent, unforgiving. But the man beside her sat steady as a rock. He offered no false promises. He offered no kindness, really, but he offered dignity. He offered a shield. She looked at her hands, red and raw from the cold. She thought of Arthur Thorne's sneer. She thought of the matron's pinched face. She looked at Caleb Rourke. "I do not even know you," she whispered. "You know enough," Caleb said, "and I know enough." Eliza closed her eyes. She took a breath, tasting the rain and the sage. "Don't take me back," she said softly. Caleb nodded once. He slapped the reins against the horse's rumps. "Yeah." The wagon surged forward, turning right, climbing away from the town and into the dark, wild heart of the territory. The morning broke with a clarity that stung the eyes. After the violence of the storm, the sky had scrubbed itself clean, revealing a hard, relentless blue that stretched from the muddy streets of Iron Ridge to the distant, saw-toothed peaks of the granite mountains. The air was thin and frigid, smelling of wet sage and coal smoke. Eliza Hart had not slept. The bed at the boarding house had felt like a slab of stone, and her mind had churned with the terrifying promise she had made in the dark. As the sun crested the horizon, turning the puddles in the street to sheets of copper, she dressed in her travel-stained gray wool and walked to the livery stable. She found Caleb Rourke inside, checking the hooves of a massive bay gelding. The smell of the stable was rich and warm, a mix of manure, sweet hay, and leather. Caleb looked up as she entered. In the daylight, he was even more imposing than he had been in the shadows of the wagon. He was a man built of sharp angles and heavy muscle, his face weathered by wind and sun into a permanent expression of endurance. Eliza stopped a few feet from him. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she forced her hands to hang steady at her sides. "I have thought about your offer, Mr. Rourke," she said. Her voice was thin in the cavernous space, but clear. Caleb set the horse's hoof down and straightened up. He wiped his hands on a rag, watching her, and, "I will marry you," she said. He nodded once, slowly. "Good. We can go to the preacher now." "Wait," Eliza said, stepping forward. "I have conditions." Caleb paused, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. He did not speak, but he waited. "I know what they say about you," Eliza said, the words rushing out before she could lose her nerve. "I know about the gunfight. I know you are a hard man, but I will not be a punching bag for your anger, nor a target for your scorn." She took a breath, lifting her chin. "You must promise me, Caleb Rourke, that you will never raise a hand to me in anger. And you must promise that you will never treat me as if you believe the lies they tell about my virtue. If I am to be your wife, I will be treated with respect, or I will walk out into the snow and die before I stay under your roof." Caleb looked at her for a long, silent moment. The silence stretched until the stamping of a horse in a nearby stall sounded like a gunshot. Then, the hardness around his eyes softened. "Just a fraction. I am not a beater of women, Eliza," he said quietly, "and I do not care for rumors. You have my word. I will never strike you, and as long as you are true to me, I will honor you." It was enough. It had to be enough. They were married 2 hours later in the small, drafty church at the end of Main Street. It was a bleak affair. The Reverend Thomas, a man with a sour disposition and a Bible that looked used more for thumping than reading, performed the ceremony with hurried indifference. His wife stood in the back, her arms crossed over her chest, watching Eliza with the sharp, predatory gaze of a hawk spotting a field mouse. Two men from the mercantile served as witnesses. They stood stiffly, smelling of tobacco and judgment, exchanging glances that Eliza pretended not to see. "Do you, Caleb John Rourke, take this woman?" The preacher droned. Eliza felt the weight of the stairs boring into her back. She could hear the faint, cruel titter of the preacher's wife whispering something to one of the witnesses. "Trapped him," she imagined them saying. The spoiled goods found a desperate buyer. When Caleb took her hand to place the plain gold band on her finger, she flinched. His hand was enormous, swallowing hers completely. The skin was rough, calloused like old wood, and scarred across the knuckles. But his grip was not crushing. It was steady, careful, as if he knew she was made of something that might break. "I do," he said. His voice was a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "I do," Eliza whispered. When they walked out of the church, they were husband and wife. The sun was high now, glaring down on the mud. Caleb wasted no time. He had a wagon loaded with supplies, flour, coffee, nails, seed, and 2 saddle horses tied to the back. "You can ride?" he asked, looking at her skirts. I have ridden in the park," Eliza said. "Side saddle." Caleb grunted. "It is a long way. The wagon is rough. You might do better on the mare." "She is gentle." He cinched a side saddle onto a roan mare that looked half asleep. Eliza mounted with as much dignity as she could muster, settling her skirts. She refused to look at the townspeople watching from the boardwalks. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the mountains rose like a wall between her past and her future. They rode out in silence. The town fell away, replaced by the vast, terrifying emptiness of the territory. The land was a rolling ocean of yellow grass and sage, broken only by rocky outcrops and the occasional twist of a scrub oak. The wind was relentless, cutting through her thin shawl, chilling the sweat on her neck. For the first hour, Eliza held herself rigid. She wanted to show this man, this stranger who was now her husband, that she was not weak. But the park horses of Philadelphia were nothing like this. The terrain was uneven, littered with stones and gopher holes. The mare plodded along, but the gait was choppy. By the second hour, Eliza's legs were cramping. The awkward angle of the side saddle twisted her spine. Every step of the horse sent a jolt of pain through her hip. She bit her lip until it tasted of copper, determined not to complain. Caleb rode ahead in the wagon, his back to her, a solitary figure against the immense sky. The trouble happened near a washout, a deep gash in the earth carved by the recent storm. The water was receding, but the mud was slick and treacherous. As the wagon rattled through the ford, a tumbleweed, dislodged by the wind, rolled erratically across the path. The roan mare, tired and grumpy, shied violently. She twisted to the left, her hooves scrabbling on the loose shale. Eliza gasped, losing her seat. The saddle offered no purchase. She slid dangerously to the side, gripping the single horn with white-knuckled desperation. The world tilted. She saw the muddy water of the washout rushing up to meet her. "Whoa!" The shout cracked through the air. Before Eliza could fall, a hand clamped onto the bridle of her mare, wrenching the animal's head down. Caleb had leaped from the moving wagon, moving with a speed that belied his size. He controlled the spooked horse with sheer strength, his boots sliding in the mud as he brought the animal to a halt. Eliza clung to the neck of the mare, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Her hat had been knocked askew, and her hair had come loose from its pins. "Are you hurt?" Caleb asked. He was standing right beside her leg, his hand on the mare's neck, soothing the animal with low, murmuring sounds. "No," Eliza stammered, pushing herself upright. I am sorry. I just lost my balance." Caleb looked at her. He saw the pale exhaustion in her face, the way she favored her left hip, the trembling of her hands. He looked at the side saddle, then at the rough terrain ahead. "That rig is no good for this country," he said bluntly. "And you are tired." "I can manage," Eliza insisted, though her voice wavered. "You will fall," Caleb said. "And if you break a leg out here, it is a long, painful ride to a doctor who might not even be sober." He tied the mare to the back of the wagon alongside the other spare horse. Then he walked to his own mount, the massive bay gelding he had unhitched from the wagon team to lead them across the washout. He swung into the saddle with fluid grace. "Come here," he said, extending a hand down to her. Eliza stared at him. "What?" "Ride with me," he said. "The wagon is too rough for you right now, and you cannot handle the mare on this ground. Come on." He reached down, gripping her under the arms. Eliza gave a small squeak of surprise as he lifted her effortlessly, pulling her up across the pommel of his saddle. She landed sideways, her legs dangling over the horse's shoulder, her back pressed against Caleb's chest. It was scandalous. It was intimate. It was terrifying. "Put your arms around my waist," he instructed, gathering the reins. "And hold on." Eliza hesitated, her face burning. She could feel the heat of his body through his canvas coat. She could smell the soap he had used that morning, mixed with the scent of tobacco and rain. Caleb didn't wait. He clicked his tongue, and the big bay surged forward. Eliza gave a sharp intake of breath and grabbed the leather of his coat, burying her face in his shoulder to hide her blush. But as the horse moved, she felt something change. The gelding had a long, rolling stride, powerful and smooth. It was nothing like the choppy gait of the mare, and behind her, Caleb was a solid wall. His arms came around her to hold the reins, effectively boxing her in, keeping her safe. "Relax," he murmured, his voice rumbling against her back. "Move with him. Do not fight it." Eliza slowly loosened her death grip on his coat. She let her body sway with the rhythm of the horse. The wind was still cold, but blocked by Caleb's broad shoulders. It no longer cut to the bone. They moved across the land, a single entity of man, woman, and horse. They crossed shallow streams where the water splashed high and silver. They climbed ridges where the wind whipped her hair across Caleb's face, and he did not brush it away. For the first time in months, since the scandal broke in Philadelphia, Eliza did not feel exposed. She felt anchored. "I have never ridden like this," she whispered, the words lost to the wind. Caleb leaned forward slightly to hear her. "What did you say?" Eliza turned her head, looking up at him. Her eyes were bright, the fear replaced by a sudden, intoxicating rush of adrenaline. A laugh bubbled up in her throat, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "I said I have never ridden like this," she called out, breathless. "It feels like flying." Caleb looked down at her. Her cheeks were flushed with wind and excitement, her eyes wide. For a moment, the guarded mask he wore slipped. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. "It is the only way to travel," he said. The tension in Eliza's shoulders melted away. She leaned back against him, trusting him to hold her. The miles passed in a haze of rhythmic motion and shared warmth. She became aware of the strength in his arms as he guided the horse, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blade. It was a strange, thrilling awareness, a physical closeness with a man she barely knew, yet who was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. They arrived at the ranch at dusk. It sat in the cup of a valley, sheltered by a ridge of pine. The house was built of weathered logs, gray as driftwood. A lean-to barn stood to the side, its roof patched with tin. A windmill creaked mournfully in the gusts, pumping water into a wooden trough. Beyond the fences, cattle grazed on the yellow grass, dark shapes under a sky that was turning a bruised purple. It was lonely. It was isolated. It was the end of the world. Caleb lowered her from the horse. Her legs were numb, and she stumbled. He caught her, his hands lingering on her waist for a second longer than necessary before he stepped back. "Home," he said, though the word sounded strange in his mouth. Inside, the house was clean but stark. There were no curtains on the windows, only shutters. A sturdy table with 2 chairs dominated the main room. A small bookshelf held a few worn volumes, Shakespeare, a Bible, a book on animal husbandry. There was only one bedroom. Eliza stood in the doorway of the bedroom, looking at the large iron bed covered in a heavy quilt. Her throat went dry. The reality of their arrangement crashed down on her. Caleb walked past her, carrying her carpet bag. He set it down at the foot of the bed. He turned to face her, taking off his hat. The lamp he had lit cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the scar on his jaw. "Eliza," he said. She jumped slightly at the sound of her name. "Yes?" He looked at the bed, then at her. He seemed to struggle for words. "I told you I would not force you," he said, his voice low. "And I meant it. You are my wife. This is your bed. But I do not expect duties. Not tonight. Not until you are ready. If ever." Eliza looked at him, surprised. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched the brim of his hat. He was a man, and she knew men had needs, but she also saw a deep, abiding loneliness in him that mirrored her own. She felt a flicker of something in her belly, not fear, but a strange, soft heat, desire, or just gratitude. She did not know. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered. She hesitated, then stepped into the room. "But it is cold, and the bunkhouse looks drafty." She turned to face him, her face flaming but her eyes steady. "We are married. We can share the bed. To sleep." Caleb stared at her. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." That night was an agony of awkwardness and tenderness. They undressed in the dark, turning their backs to one another. When they climbed into the high bed, the mattress groaned. They lay inches apart, stiff as boards. The silence was loud. Outside, a coyote howled, a lonely, yipping sound that made the house feel like a raft on a dark ocean. Eliza could feel the heat radiating from Caleb's body. She could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing. She wanted to reach out and touch his arm, just to reassure herself that she was not alone. But she did not dare. "Good night, Eliza," Caleb whispered into the dark. "Good night, Caleb." She fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, feeling safer than she had in a year. The next few days were a blur of labor. Eliza threw herself into the work of the ranch with a desperation born of fear that if she was not useful, she would be cast out. She learned to cook on the temperamental iron stove, burning her fingers and the biscuits until she mastered the dampers. She hauled water from the pump until her hands were blistered and her back ached. She swept the dust that seemed to seep through the very walls. Caleb watched her, wary at first, then with a growing respect. He did not hover, but he was always there when the work was too heavy. He taught her how to move among the animals. "Don't look them in the eye like a predator," he told her gently, guiding her hand to the neck of a milk cow. "Move slow. Let them know you are there. Talk to them." She learned that his voice, rough as it was with people, was magic with beasts. He spoke in a low drone that settled the nervous cattle. One afternoon, he found her mending a tear in his work coat. The stitches were small and precise. He ran his thumb over the repair, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My mother used to sew like this," he said quietly. "It is good work, Eliza. Thank you." The praise, simple as it was, made Eliza's chest tighten. She turned away to hide the flush of pleasure, realizing how starved she had been for kindness. The riding lessons began the next week. Caleb insisted she learn to ride astride. "You cannot work cattle in a dress and a side saddle," he said. He gave her a pair of his old trousers, cut down and belted tight. Eliza felt absurd and exposed wearing men's clothing. But once she was in the saddle, a proper Western saddle this time, she felt the difference. She was riding the roan mare in the corral. Caleb stood in the center, holding a lunge line. Heels down, he commanded, "Sit deep. Do not perch." Eliza tried to adjust her seat, but the mare sidestepped. Eliza panicked, leaning forward, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. She slipped, sliding ungracefully down the mare's flank. She braced herself for the impact with the dirt, but it never came. Caleb was there. He caught her by the waist and elbow, absorbing her weight. She slammed into him, her chest against his, her face inches from his neck. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Eliza could feel the hard muscle of his arms, the rapid beat of his heart through his shirt. The air between them suddenly felt charged, heavy with static. She looked up, and his eyes were dark, pupils dilated. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then snapped back up to her eyes. He set her on her feet and stepped back as if he had been burned. "Keep your heels down," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Try again." Eliza climbed back on the horse, her heart thundering so loud she was sure he could hear it. Winter was coming. The evenings grew shorter, the cold biting deeper. One night, the wind was howling around the eaves with a mournful shriek. Snow clouds were piling up over the western hills, blotting out the stars. They sat by the stove, drinking bitter coffee from tin cups. The warmth of the fire created a small, intimate circle of light in the dark house. Eliza looked at Caleb. He was staring into the flames, his face drawn. "Why do they hate you, Caleb?" she asked softly. "I mean, really?" Caleb took a sip of coffee. He did not look at her. "Because I lived," he said. Eliza waited. 6 years ago. He said, "A winter like this one. My father, my mother, and my little brother, Samuel. We were bringing the herd down from the high pasture. The storm hit fast, a whiteout. You could not see your hand in front of your face." He paused, his knuckles white on the cup. "My father's horse broke a leg. My mother stayed with him. I took Samuel. I told them I would get him to the line shack and come back, but the snow, I got turned around. I lost the trail. Samuel was only 10. He got so cold. I tried to carry him." Caleb's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. A harsh sound. "I passed out. When I woke up, the storm had broken. I was half frozen, but I was alive. He was gone, and my parents were found 3 days later. Frozen." Eliza's hand covered her mouth. "Oh, Caleb. The town." Caleb continued bitterly. "They said I panicked. They said I left them to save myself. The law cleared me. But in their eyes, I am the man who walked away from his family to save his own skin. And then, when that boy drew on me in the saloon last year, they saw what they wanted to see. A killer." He looked at her then, his eyes raw with a grief that had never healed. Eliza reached out. She did not think about it. She laid her hand over his rough, scarred fist on the table. "They are wrong," she said fiercely. "You are not that man. You are the man who stopped a wagon in the rain for a stranger. You are the man who catches me when I fall." Caleb looked at her hand covering his. He turned his hand over, slowly, interlacing his fingers with hers. His palm was warm. "And you?" he asked. "Why did you really leave?" Eliza looked down at their joined hands. "My father gambled everything away," she whispered. "We lost the house, the servants, my fiancé. He did not want a penniless bride, but it was not just the money." She took a breath. "I was seen in a parlor with a man. Julian, he was persistent. He cornered me. I shouted, and he left. Nothing happened. He never even touched me. But the maid saw us, and by the next morning, the story was that I had given myself to him to pay my father's debts." She looked up, tears stinging her eyes. "I was innocent, Caleb, but it did not matter. The lie was more interesting than the truth." Caleb's grip tightened on her hand. His jaw hardened, the muscle jumping under the skin. "It is a poison," he said softly. "Gossip. It eats everything good." He lifted her hand, bringing it to his lips. He pressed a kiss to her knuckles, rough, hesitant, and incredibly gentle. "I believe you, Eliza," he said. The touch sent a shockwave through her. It was not the touch of a husband claiming a right. It was the touch of a man offering an alliance, a shared fortress against a cruel world. In the dim light of the stove, with the snow beginning to hiss against the window panes, the distance between them shrank. They were two outcasts, battered by lies and loss. finding that their jagged edges fit together. Eliza did not pull her hand away. She let it stay in his, an anchor in the storm. "We will survive this," she whispered. Caleb looked at her, and for the first time, the darkness in his eyes seemed to recede, replaced by a flicker of something dangerous and beautiful. Hope. "Yes," he said. "We will." Winter tightened its grip on the high plains of the Wyoming Territory with the slow, crushing pressure of a vice. The transition was not gentle. It was a siege. The mornings dawned with a silence so profound it felt heavy. The windows of the ranch house thick with fern-like patterns of frost that obscured the outside world. Inside, the air was bitter and sharp until Eliza coaxed the iron stove into a roar, her breath hanging in white clouds before her face as she shivered in her nightdress. Feeding kindling to the flames, life had shrunk to the radius of the hearth's warmth. Yet the work of the ranch demanded they step out into the teeth of the wind. It was on one of these brittle, freezing Tuesdays that Eliza finally abandoned the last pretense of Eastern propriety. The side saddle was a danger on the slick, frozen ground, and her heavy skirts were nothing but a trap waiting to snag on a fence post or freeze stiff in the drifts. Caleb had laid the trousers on the bed without a word. They were an old pair of his, wool worn soft at the knees, smelling of cedar and sage. He had left a belt with them, punched with new holes to accommodate her slender waist. Eliza stared at them for a long time. In Philadelphia, a woman wearing such garments would have been committed to an asylum or arrested for indecency. But Philadelphia was 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. Here, the wind did not care about her virtue, only her warmth. She put them on. They were warm, scratching slightly against her skin, but the freedom of movement was a shock. She pulled on her boots, wrapped a heavy coat over her flannel shirt, and walked out to the barn, keeping her head down, feeling a burning flush of mortification on her cheeks. Caleb was saddling the horses. He looked up as she entered, his eyes sweeping over her strange silhouette. For a second, she braced herself for a comment, a joke, something to mark the absurdity of her appearance. Instead, he simply nodded. "Your stirrups are shortened," he said, his voice rough with the morning cold. "We will check the south fence." They rode out, the snow crunching loudly under the hooves. Eliza sat deep in the western saddle, her legs gripping the barrel of the roan mare. It was a revelation. With a leg on either side of the horse, she felt centered, secure, and powerful. She was no longer a passenger perched precariously on a shelf. She was a rider. They reached the back pasture, a wide expanse of white broken by the dark skeletons of scrub oak. The wind had died down, leaving the air crisp and still. "Let her run," Caleb called out from his big bay gelding. Eliza hesitated, then squeezed her calves against the mare's sides. The horse, eager for warmth, surged forward. The gallop was not the terrifying, unbalanced lurch she remembered from the side saddle. It was a rhythmic, thundering flight. Eliza felt the power of the animal beneath her, the cold air rushing into her lungs, stinging and exhilarating. She leaned forward, urging the mare faster, the old trousers protecting her legs from the chafing leather. For the first time in 2 years, the heavy cloak of shame and scandal lifted. She was just a body in motion, a spirit flying over the frozen earth. A laugh bubbled up from her chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that rang out across the valley. Caleb pulled his gelding up on a rise, watching her. He saw the way she handled the horse, her body moving in perfect sync with the animal, her hair escaping her hat to stream behind her like a banner. He heard her laugh, bright and defiant against the silence of the winter landscape, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun curled in his chest. It was a dangerous feeling, a softening of the hard shell he had built around his heart since the blizzard had taken his kin. He watched her turn the mare and lope back toward him, her face flushed with cold and happiness, and he had to look away toward the mountains to hide the hunger in his eyes. But the isolation of the ranch could not protect them forever. In Iron Ridge, the stories were mutating, growing teeth and claws in the board, overheated parlors and saloons. The sight of Caleb Rourke's wife riding astride, wearing men's breeches, had been noted by a passing peddler, and the news had traveled faster than a telegraph. She rides like a man. The whispers went unnatural. But then, what do you expect from a woman who was ruined before she ever arrived? The older ranch wives, women who had survived the frontier by clinging rigidly to the very rules the land tried to break, shook their heads with grim satisfaction. He does not care what she is, they murmured over tea. He takes what he can get. It is a house of sin out there in the valley. The men in the saloon were less poetic. They snickered into their beer, making crude jokes about who wore the pants in the Rourke household, feeding the narrative that Eliza was wild, broken, and available. The poison of the town eventually came to their door. It arrived in a shiny black buggy that looked ridiculous navigating the rutted track to the ranch. Two men stepped out. One was Silas Finch, the local banker, a man with a smile that showed too many teeth and eyes that calculated the cost of everything they touched. The other was a stranger, Mr. Sterling, a representative from the railroad, dressed in a suit that cost more than Caleb's entire herd. Caleb met them on the porch. He did not invite them in. Eliza stood by the window, hidden by the shadow of the interior, listening. Mr. Rourke, Silas Finch began, rubbing his gloved hands together. Cold winter we are having. Brutal. State your business. Silas, Caleb said, his thumbs hooked in his belt. Mr. Sterling stepped forward. He smelled of bay rum and city coal. We are here to make you a generous offer. Mr. Rourke, the railroad is looking to expand its depot facilities. We require land for a water station and holding pens. Your south pasture, specifically the section bordering the creek, is ideal. Caleb's expression did not change. That section controls the water for my entire lower range. If I sell it, I cut my own throat. Sterling smiled. A thin, patronizing expression. We are prepared to offer you $300. It is a fair price for grazing land. It is worth 3 times that, Caleb said flatly. And without the water, the rest of the ranch is worthless. The answer is no. Finch cleared his throat. Stepping closer, Caleb, be reasonable. The railroad is progress. You cannot stand in the way of progress. Besides, we would hate to see things get difficult for you. Difficult? Caleb asked, his voice dropping an octave. You are a man with a complicated history, Finch said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial, oily tone. And your new wife, well, her reputation is fragile, is it not? Rumors are ugly things. Caleb, they can make it very hard for a man to do business, to find buyers for his beef, to get credit at the store. Eliza's breath hitched. She pressed her hand to her mouth. They were using her. Her past was a weapon they were holding to Caleb's head. Caleb went very still. It was the stillness of a predator before the strike. He took one step forward, looming over the banker. Are you threatening me, Silas? I am merely offering advice. Finch stammered, stepping back. For the sake of peace, you want to live quietly, do you not, with your wife? Get off my land, Caleb said. The words were quiet, but they carried a violence that made the two men flinch. Mr. Rourke, consider the... Sterling began. Now, Caleb barked. The men scrambled back into their buggy. As they turned the horses, Finch shouted back, bravado returning with distance. You are making a mistake, Rourke. You cannot fight the money. You will regret this. Caleb watched them go, standing at the fence line long after the buggy had disappeared over the ridge. His fists were clenched at his sides, the leather of his gloves straining. He knew, as surely as he knew the signs of a coming storm, that a quiet war had just been declared. Eliza walked out onto the porch. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders. Caleb turned. His face was a mask of fury. But when he saw her, he tried to smooth it away. You heard. He said, I heard. She walked down the steps to stand beside him. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles. You should have taken the money, she said softly. Caleb looked at her as if she had slapped him. What? I am a liability. Caleb. She looked down at the frozen ground. They are going to use me to hurt you. My reputation, it is a weight around your neck. Maybe you would be better off if I left, if you did not have the burden of defending a ruined woman." Caleb reached out and took her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, almost painful. "Stop it," he hissed. He shook her. Just once, gently. "Look at me. Eliza." She looked up. His eyes were blazing with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I made a choice," he said, his voice rough. "I chose you. I do not regret it. Not for a second. Let them talk. Let them try to squeeze us. I would rather lose every acre of this land than bow to men like that. And I would rather have you, with all your so-called ruin, than the respect of every hypocrite in that town." His words were gruff, angry even. But the sentiment behind them hit Eliza with the force of a physical blow. He was not just defending his property. He was defending her. Her chest ached with a mixture of hope and terror. He was willing to fight the world for her. But could they win? 2 weeks later, the larder was running low. They had to go to town. It was a gray, sullen day. Iron Ridge was busy. The streets churned into frozen ruts of mud and ice. Eliza walked beside Caleb, keeping her head high, ignoring the heads that turned as they passed. She wore her best dress, concealed under a heavy wool coat, but she felt naked under the stairs. They loaded the wagon with flour, coffee, and sugar. As they passed the saloon, the doors swung open, spilling warm, stale air and noise onto the boardwalk. A group of cowhands from the Triple Bar Ranch spilled out, laughing. They were young, drunk, and mean. "Well, look who it is," one of them drawled, leaning against the post. The happy couple, another one, a man with a broken nose and watery eyes, looked Eliza up and down with a leer that made her skin crawl. "Hey there, Missy," he called out. "Is it true what they say, that you learned a few tricks back east?" The other men laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Caleb stopped. He did not turn, but Eliza felt his arm tense under her hand. "Come on, Caleb," she whispered, tugging at him. "Please, just walk away." But the man with the broken nose was emboldened. He stepped off the boardwalk, blocking their path. He reached out a dirty hand and grabbed Eliza's wrist. "Do not be shy, darling," he slurred. "Why don't you come inside and show us how a city girl rides?" The world seemed to stop. Eliza froze, the man's fingers digging into her skin. Then a shadow moved. Caleb did not draw the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. He stepped in, moving with terrifying speed. He caught the man's wrist, the one holding Eliza, in a grip that looked like it could crush bone. He twisted. The man yelped, his knees buckling as he was forced down into the mud. Caleb leaned down. His face was inches from the man's ear. He did not shout. His voice was a low, lethal vibration, like the growl of a wolf protecting its kill. "Touch her again," Caleb said, "and I will remove the hand." "Do you understand me?" The cowboy nodded frantically, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Caleb released him. The man scrambled backward in the mud, clutching his wrist. The other cowhands had gone silent, their hands hovering near their guns but not daring to draw. They saw the look in Caleb Rourke's eyes, the look of a man who had killed before and was ready to do it again. "We are leaving," Caleb said to the group. He took Eliza's elbow and guided her to the wagon. They climbed up and drove out of town without looking back. But the damage was done. Eliza could feel the eyes of the town on them, the shopkeepers in their windows, the women on the street. As the wagon rattled over the frozen plains, the silence between them was suffocating. Back at the ranch, as soon as the door latched behind them, Eliza shattered. She threw her bonnet onto the table with a cry of frustration. She paced the small room, her hands tangling in her hair. "Did you see them?" she cried, her voice cracking. "Did you hear them? They think I am a whore. Caleb, they think I am dirt." Caleb stood by the door, watching her. "They are fools. Eliza, drunks." "It does not matter if they are drunks," she screamed, turning on him. "It is what everyone thinks. I am branded. I never did anything. I never touched that man in Philadelphia. I was innocent. And now I am here, working my fingers to the bone, trying to be a good wife, and I am still just spoiled goods. She collapsed onto one of the chairs, burying her face in her hands, sobbing with the weight of months of suppressed shame. It is not fair. I just wanted to survive. Caleb watched her weep. The sound tore at him. He walked over to the table and sat opposite her. He reached out, hesitating, then pulled his hand back. I used to think that way too, he admitted quietly. Eliza looked up, her eyes red and swollen. What? Before I met you, he said, staring at the grain of the wood table. When I heard about women who were ruined, I thought, well, where there is smoke, there is fire. I thought a woman's virtue was something she either kept or threw away. I judged them. Eliza stared at him, hurt flashing in her eyes. But then Caleb continued, his voice hardening. I remembered the blizzard. He looked up at her, and his eyes were full of a dark, swirling pain. When my family died, the town needed a reason. They could not accept that the weather just kills, that God takes good people for no reason. So they made a story. They said I was reckless. They said I was arrogant. They said I left my brother to die because I was a coward. He slammed his hand on the table. It was a lie. I carried him until my legs gave out. I crawled through the snow until I went black. But it did not matter. The lie made sense to them. It made them feel safe. If I was the villain, then they were safe from the storm. He looked at Eliza, his expression softening. I see you. Eliza, I see how easy it is to destroy a person with words. You are not what they say, and I am sorry that my name, my reputation, is dragging you down further. Eliza wiped her tears. She looked at this scarred, broken man, and she felt a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness. It is not your fault, she said. It is us against them, Caleb. But the anger was still there, buzzing in the air like a trapped fly. They argued then, a sharp, jagged release of tension. She accused him of being too reckless in the saloon. He accused her of caring too much about the opinions of people who meant nothing. They went to bed in silence, the air in the small house thick with unsaid words. 2 nights later, the real winter arrived. It began as a low moan in the chimney, then escalated into a shriek. The wind hit the house like a physical blow, shaking the timbers. The temperature plummeted. Snow drove against the walls, finding every crack, piling up in drifts that reached the windowsills in hours. The roof groaned under the weight. Caleb was restless. He paced the floor. I have to check the stock, he said, pulling on his heavy buffalo coat. The barn roof is old. If it caves in, we lose the horses. You cannot go out there, Eliza cried, grabbing his arm. It is a whiteout. Caleb, you will get lost. I have a rope, he said, tying a heavy lariat around his waist. I will tie off to the porch. I will be back. He opened the door, and the storm swallowed him instantly. Eliza stood by the door, watching the rope play out. The cold that rushed in was terrifying. She slammed the door and waited. 5 minutes, 10, 20. She paced. She prayed. She imagined him out there, wandering in the white void, just like he had 6 years ago. Not again, she whispered. Please, God, not again. She went to the window, scraping away the frost. She could see nothing but swirling white. The rope tied to the porch post was pulled taut, vibrating in the wind. Then, the door burst open. Caleb stumbled in, accompanied by a swirl of snow. He fell to his knees, gasping. He was covered in white, his eyebrows and beard crusted with ice. His skin was a frightening shade of gray. Caleb! Eliza was there in an instant. She kicked the door shut and latched it against the wind. She fell to her knees beside him. He was shaking violently, his teeth chattering so hard he couldn't speak. He had been out too long. The cold had seeped into his core. We have to get you warm, Eliza said, her voice trembling but efficient. She dragged him toward the fire. His fingers were too stiff to work the buttons of his coat. Here, let me, she said. She peeled the frozen coat off him. It clattered to the floor like a board. She pulled off his boots, his sodden wool socks. His feet were white and cold as marble. She worked frantically. stripping him of his freezing clothes until he was in his long johns. She chafed his hands, his arms, trying to bring the blood back. Her hands moved over his skin, his broad shoulders, the scars on his chest, the icy expanse of his back. It was not the touch of a nurse anymore. It was desperate. It was possessive. Caleb stopped shaking enough to look at her. He sat on the rug before the stove, and she was kneeling between his legs, her hands on his chest. The firelight flickered over them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm howled like a banshee, screaming of death and isolation. But inside, there was heat. Eliza looked at him. His dark eyes were wide, pupils blown. Watching her face, she saw the fear he had hidden, the fear of dying alone, the fear of losing her, and she saw the desire he had kept leashed for months. He was alive. They were alive, and the death outside made the life inside burn brighter. "Caleb," she whispered. She leaned forward. Her hands slid up his neck, threading into his damp hair. She kissed him. It was hesitant at first, a question, a trembling brush of lips. Caleb went still. Then, a low groan ripped from his throat. He reached out, his big hands cupping her face, and he kissed her back. It was not a gentle kiss. It was starving. It was the taste of coffee and desperation. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her scent. Eliza gasped, feeling the hardness of his body against hers. The fear of the storm evaporated, replaced by a fierce, driving need. She didn't want to be the fragile lady anymore. She wanted to be this raw, real woman holding on to her husband in the dark. "Take me to bed," she whispered against his mouth. Caleb pulled back, looking at her, searching for any sign of hesitation. "You are sure? I am your wife. Caleb, I want you." He stood up, scooping her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her to the bed, the storm forgotten. Their first night was not a silent, dutiful act. It was full of whispered reassurances and the friction of skin on skin. Caleb was careful, his hands reverent, touching her as if he couldn't believe she was real, as if he expected her to shatter. But Eliza did not shatter. She met him, touch for touch. When he hesitated, afraid of his own strength, she pulled him closer. She guided his hands. It was about trust. It was about surrendering the armor they both wore. When they finally joined, Eliza felt a sharp, sweet shock, not just of the body, but of the soul. She was not being taken, she was giving, and she was being received. Caleb buried his face in her hair, whispering her name like a prayer. For the first time in years, he felt clean. The shame of his past, the guilt of his survival, washed away in the heat of her skin. He was not the monster the town feared. He was a man, and he was loved. Later, the storm began to ease. The howling wind dropped to a low mutter. They lay tangled in the quilts, limbs heavy and warm. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft, red glow in the room. Eliza rested her head on Caleb's chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. She traced the line of the scar on his jaw with her fingertip. "I was afraid," she confessed quietly, her voice husky. "Of the storm?" Caleb asked, his arm tightening around her. "No, of this, of wanting this life, back east. Everything is so safe, so predictable. Here, everything tries to kill you. The cold, the men, the land, but—" She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. "But I have never felt so alive. I was afraid that if I let myself love this, love you, that it would all be taken away." Caleb reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His face was open, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "I do not know how to be a husband, Eliza," he admitted, his voice rough. "I know how to work steers. I know how to fix a fence. I know how to survive, but I do not know how to be soft. I am afraid I will fail you." Eliza smiled, a soft, tired curve of her lips. "You kept me warm. Caleb, you stood up for me in the mud. You came back from the storm." She kissed his palm. "You are doing just fine." Outside, the clouds broke, the moon, full and brilliant, spilled its light over the valley. The snowdrifts glittered like crushed diamonds, vast and silent and beautiful. The land was harsh. Yes, it was unforgiving. But inside the small, battered house, something new had taken root, something stronger than the cold. They fell asleep in each other's arms. The physical and emotional distance between them closed, leaving only a fragile, fiercely real bond that defied the empty world outside. Spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory, not with a gentle unfurling of green, but with a violent, heaving thaw that turned the world to mud. The snow, which had held the land in a white chokehold for months, collapsed into slush under a sun that suddenly felt too close and too hot. The coulees ran bank full with brown, churning water, and the roads became sucking quagmires that could pull a boot right off a man's foot. It was a season of revelation. The retreating drifts revealed the bones of cattle that had huddled against the fence lines and simply stopped breathing in the deep freeze. It revealed fences blown flat by the gales, the wire twisted like rusted yarn. And down by the creek, the high water had eaten away a massive section of the bank, leaving the roots of the cottonwoods exposed and dangling like severed nerves. Eliza Rourke stood in the mud, her boots heavy with clay, gripping the handle of a wire stretcher. She wore Caleb's old trousers and a canvas coat that was stained with grease and earth. Her hands, once soft and pale from her life in Philadelphia, were now brown and calloused, stronger than she ever imagined they could be. Pull. Caleb grunted from the next post. Eliza leaned back, putting her weight into the leverage. The barbed wire sang tight, humming in the damp air. Caleb hammered the staple home with 2 sharp strikes, the sound ringing out across the empty valley. "Good," he said, straightening up and wiping sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "That should hold." Eliza released the tension and smiled at him. It was a tired smile, but it reached her eyes. Over the last month, a new lightness had settled between them. The desperate, huddled intimacy of the blizzard had evolved into a working partnership. She was no longer the fragile guest in his house. She was part of the machinery of the ranch. She watched him check the fence line, his broad back moving with a rhythm she knew by heart now. He turned, catching her staring, and the corner of his mouth ticked up. "What are you looking at, Mrs. Rourke?" he teased gently. "Just a rancher who needs a haircut," she retorted, walking over to him. Caleb caught her by the waist, pulling her in despite the mud on their clothes. He kissed her, not with the frantic hunger of the storm, but with a familiar, easy warmth. It was a stolen moment behind the shelter of the windbreak, a secret rhythm that punctuated their days of hard labor. "I will get a haircut when the calving is done," he murmured against her hair. Eliza laughed, leaning into him. The smell of him, sweat, wet wool, and tobacco, was the scent of safety. For a moment, standing there in the ruin of Winter's End, she felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. She was not the ruined girl from the East anymore. She was Eliza Rourke, and she was home. But beneath the joy, a secret was taking root. It had been 6 weeks since her last monthly bleeding. At first, she had dismissed it as a result of the cold or the hard work. But as the days passed, a faint, dizzying sensation had begun to plague her in the mornings, and certain smells, the rendering of fat, the raw scent of fresh milk, made her stomach turn. A fragile hope was blooming in her chest, terrifying and sweet. She found herself watching Caleb when he didn't know she was looking. She watched his large, scarred hands as he mended a bridle or whittled a piece of wood by the fire. And she imagined those hands holding something incredibly small, a child, a new life to replace the ones he had lost. But the fear was there, too. This land was hard on the young, and their position here was precarious. The trouble with the railroad and the banker. Silas Finch had not vanished with the snow. If anything, the thaw seemed to have brought the snakes out of their dens. Strange riders had been seen on the ridges at dusk, men who did not work for any of the neighboring ranches. They sat on their horses, silhouetted against the purple sky, watching the Rourke place. 2 days ago, Caleb had found a section of fence on the west ridge cut clean through. It was not a break from the wind or a bull. The wire had been snipped. 20 head of cattle had wandered dangerously close to a deep ravine before Caleb and Eliza had managed to turn them back. Caleb had grown quiet since then. In the evenings, instead of reading or talking, he would sit at the table with his maps and a stack of legal papers, his brow furrowed. He was a man who understood cattle and weather, but the intricate, predatory language of deeds and rights of way was a foreign tongue to him. He knew he was being circled by wolves, but these wolves wore suits and used the law as their teeth. "I have to ride to the north pasture," Caleb said one morning, buckling his gun belt. It was a gesture he made more often these days. "I want to check the water tanks. Take care." "Caleb," Eliza said, handing him a sack of biscuits. He paused, looking at her with a shadow in his eyes. "Stay close to the house. Eliza, if anyone comes, you keep the shotgun by the door." "I will," she promised. After he rode out, the silence of the house felt oppressive. The larder was low on coffee and salt. Eliza knew she should wait, but the need to be useful, to contribute something other than worry, drove her to action. She hitched the roan mare to the small buggy Caleb had fixed up for her and set out for Iron Ridge. The town was a mess of mud and activity. Wagons churned through the slurry of the main street. As Eliza tied the mare outside the general store, she felt the familiar weight of eyes on her. She walked into the store, the bell jingling cheerfully. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Thorne, was behind the counter measuring fabric for a customer. When she saw Eliza, her face went rigid. She dropped the fabric and moved to the far end of the counter, pointedly turning her back. Eliza swallowed the lump of humiliation in her throat and began to gather her supplies. A sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a small bag of peppermint sticks for Caleb. A surprise. As she moved through the aisles, she heard the whispers. They were not even trying to be quiet anymore. "Look at her," a voice murmured. "Bold as brass. I heard she is with child," another whispered. "Already? Well, they say she was experienced before she ever got here. Who knows whose child it is?" Eliza's hand froze on a tin of peaches. The blood drained from her face. How could they know? She had not even told Caleb yet. But gossip in a frontier town was a dark magic. It divined secrets from the air. She walked to the counter to pay. Standing there was Mrs. Gable, the pious woman who ran the boarding house where Eliza had spent that first miserable night. Mrs. Gable was a large woman with a face like a clenched fist. "Mrs. Rourke, Mrs. Gable said loudly, her voice dripping with false concern. "We were just saying what a pity it is." Eliza looked at her, trembling slightly. "Excuse me? A pity that a child should be raised so far out." "Mrs. Gable continued, looking around to ensure she had an audience. "Away from the school, away from the church, and away from proper moral influences. It takes a decent woman to raise a decent child, after all. And out there, with your history, well, it is a shame for the innocent, is it not?" The store went silent. The implication hung in the air. Eliza was unfit. Her child would be tainted. Eliza looked at the faces around her, the smirking men, the judgmental women. She felt small and dirty, the way they wanted her to feel. She wanted to run, but then she remembered Caleb. She remembered him standing in the mud, twisting the wrist of the man who had touched her. She remembered his voice saying, "I chose you." She lifted her chin, her hands, resting on the counter, stopped shaking. "My husband and I are building a home." "Mrs. Gable," Eliza said, her voice clear and steady. "It is a home built on hard work and loyalty, which is more than I can say for a town that feeds on the misery of strangers. What happens in my marriage, and what happens in my womb, is none of your concern, and it is certainly none of God's business what you whisper in this store." She threw the coins for her goods on the counter, hard silver dollars that rang out like a gavel. "Good day," she said. She grabbed her supplies and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She was shaking by the time she got the buggy moving. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her sick and lightheaded. She drove the mare hard. wanting only to be back within the fences Caleb had built. The weather turned as she reached the halfway point. Thunderheads, black and anvil-shaped, had built up over the mountains unnoticed. They rolled down into the valley with terrifying speed. The sky turned a sickly green. The wind picked up, whipping the mane of the mare into a frenzy. Eliza urged the horse on, clicking her tongue. "Come on, girl, almost there." A crack of thunder shook the ground, vibrating through the seat of the buggy. Then, a bolt of lightning, jagged and blindingly white, struck a solitary cottonwood tree 100 yards to her left. The sound was deafening, an explosion of light and noise. The mare screamed. She reared up in the traces, twisting violently. Eliza fought the reins, but the buggy lurched into a deep rut. The wheel caught. The buggy tipped. Eliza was thrown. She hit the muddy ground hard, rolling through the wet sagebrush. The breath was knocked out of her. She lay there for a moment, stunned, looking up at the rain that had begun to fall in driving sheets. Mud was in her mouth, her eyes. She scrambled up, ignoring the sharp pain in her shoulder. The mare had broken free of the traces and was bolting toward the horizon. The buggy lay on its side, a broken wheel spinning lazily. "I have to get home," she gasped. She began to walk. It was 3 miles. The rain soaked her instantly, chilling her to the bone. Every step was a battle against the mud that tried to drag her down. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, whispering a frantic prayer. "Please, let the baby be safe, please." When the ranch house finally came into view through the gray curtain of rain, Eliza stopped. The barn door was swinging open in the wind, and, coming from the hayloft, there was a thin, dark trail of smoke. Fire. She ran until her lungs burned, slipping and sliding in the yard. "Caleb!" she screamed. As she reached the barn, she saw him. Caleb was up in the loft, beating at a pile of smoldering hay with a wet saddle blanket. The roof above him was leaking, water dripping onto the blackened patch. He shoved the burning hay out the loft door, sending it tumbling into the mud below, where it hissed and died. He looked down and saw her standing in the rain, covered in mud, holding her arm. "Eliza!" He scrambled down the ladder and ran to her. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes wild. "Where is the buggy? Are you hurt?" The horse spooked. "The lightning," Eliza stammered, pointing at the smoke. "The fire." "Someone set it," Caleb growled, looking back at the barn. "I found an oil rag. They tried to burn us out. If the rain hadn't started, if I hadn't come back early." He looked back at her, seeing her shivering, her pale face. He scooped her up into his arms and carried her toward the house. Inside, he set her down near the stove and began to frantically feed wood into the fire. He was shaking with rage. "I will kill them," he muttered. "I will find them and I will kill them." "Caleb, stop," Eliza said, her teeth chattering. She reached out and took his hand. He looked at her, his face streaked with soot and rain. "Caleb, I have to tell you something." He froze. "What is it? Are you injured?" "No. I mean, I don't think so, but—" She took a deep breath, pressing his hand against her stomach. "I think I am with child. Caleb." The silence in the room was absolute, save for the crackling of the fire. Caleb stared at her stomach, then up at her face, his expression fractured. The rage drained away, replaced by a shock so profound it looked like fear. "A child?" he whispered. "Yes, I have been sure for a week." Caleb fell to his knees before her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her wet lap. His shoulders shook. "A baby," he murmured. "Oh, God, Eliza!" He looked up, and his eyes were wet. A tight, fragile joy broke through the fear on his face. "I will protect you," he swore, his voice fierce. "I will build a wall around this house high enough to touch the sky. No one will touch you. No one will touch him." He held her as the storm raged outside, and for an hour they allowed themselves to believe that love was a shield strong enough to stop the world. But the world was cruel, and the body was fragile. 3 days later, the sun was shining. The mud was beginning to dry. Caleb was out repairing the corral fence, determined to fortify their home. Eliza was inside, sweeping the floor. She felt a sudden, sharp cramp in her lower belly. It was like a knife twisting. She gasped, dropping the broom. She grabbed the edge of the table, doubling over. "No," she whispered. "No, please." Another cramp ripped through her, stronger than the first. And then the warm, terrifying sensation of wetness running down her legs. She stumbled toward the bedroom. She had to lie down. If she lay down, it would stop. It had to stop. She didn't make it. She collapsed on the rough wooden floor near the foot of the bed. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that narrowed her vision to a tunnel. She curled into a ball, clutching her stomach, weeping. She called out for Caleb, but her voice was a thin, reedy sound that didn't reach past the walls. She was alone. The world was dissolving into a blur of agony and loss. She felt the life slipping out of her, a tide she could not stem. Caleb found her 20 minutes later. He came in through the door, calling her name, a joke on his lips. He stopped. He saw the broom on the floor. He saw her crumpled form. He saw the dark stain spreading on her gray skirts. "No!" The scream tore from his throat. He was at her side in 2 strides. He gathered her up, ignoring the blood, ignoring the horror. Her face was chalk white, her lips blue and trembling. "Eliza, stay with me," he begged, laying her on the bed. He brought water. He brought towels. He did everything he knew how to do, his hands shaking so hard he could barely wring out the cloth. But there was nothing to be done. Nature was taking its course, indifferent to his pleas. He sat by the bed, holding her hand, watching the light fade from her eyes as she slipped into a feverish sleep. He watched the small, wordless hope they had built together dissolve into the blood-stained sheets. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Not in the blizzard, not in the gunfight. This was a different kind of death, quiet, intimate, and stealing the future before it had even begun. The days that followed were a gray blur of grief. Eliza lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling. She felt hollowed out, a shell. "It was the ride," she whispered one evening, her voice dead, the buggy tipping. "The fall, I did this. Caleb, I killed it." "No," Caleb said, sitting in the chair by the window, staring out at the darkening hills. "It was not the ride. It was the stress," he said, his voice bitter. "The fear, the railroad, the town. They poisoned the air. I could not give you peace. I promised to protect you, and I failed." He stood up and walked out of the room. She heard the front door open and close. They pulled apart. It was not a conscious decision. It was a retreat into their own private fortresses of pain. Eliza withdrew into silence. She went through the motions of living, cooking, cleaning, but her spirit was gone. She spent hours sitting on the porch, staring at the barren hills, wondering if her body was broken, if she was indeed the ruined thing the town said she was. Caleb stayed outside. He worked like a man possessed. He fixed fences until his hands were raw and bleeding. He rode the range until his horse was staggering. He came in only when it was fully dark, ate in silence, and lay down beside her like a stranger. He could not look at her without seeing the pain he felt responsible for, and she could not look at him without seeing the father of the child she had failed to keep. One evening, a week after the loss, Eliza was walking near the edge of the property line, down by the creek where the bank had eroded. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the water. She heard voices. She froze, stepping behind the trunk of a large cottonwood. 2 men were stopped on the trail on the other side of the creek. She recognized the horses. They belonged to the Triple Bar Ranch, the outfit that worked closely with the banker. Should have seen him. One man laughed. Rourke was running around that barn like a scalded cat. Shame the rain put it out. The other said, lighting a cigarette. Would have been a nice bonfire. Taught that Rourke some manners. He will learn. The first man said, Finch says the railroad is going to squeeze him until he pops. And with that wife of his, I hear she's sick. Maybe she'll do him a favor and die. Save him the trouble of feeding her. They laughed, a casual, cruel sound that drifted across the water. Eliza stood there, trembling. But it was not fear this time. It was a cold, white-hot rage. It started in her belly, in the empty place where her child had been, and it spread through her veins like fire. They had set the fire. They were laughing about it. They were wishing her dead. She walked back to the house. She walked with a purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. She threw the door open. Caleb was sitting at the table, staring at a map. A bottle of whiskey open before him. "I heard them," she said. Caleb looked up, his eyes dull. "Who? The men, by the creek. They admitted it. Caleb, they set the fire. They laughed about it. They said they are going to squeeze you until you break." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands. "I know." "You know?" Eliza asked, her voice rising. "You know they did it, and you are sitting here? What do you want me to do?" "Eliza," Caleb asked wearily, "ride out there and shoot them?" "Yes," she cried. "Fight back. Go to the sheriff. Drag them into the street. Do something. The sheriff is on Finch's payroll," Caleb shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "If I ride out there and start shooting, I hang, or I go to prison. And then where are you? Alone, starving." "So we do nothing?" Eliza screamed, tears streaming down her face. "We let them burn us? We let them kill our baby?" Caleb flinched as if she had struck him. He stood up, his chair clattering back. "Don't say that! Do not say they killed the baby! It was the fear," she sobbed. "It was the running. It was them, and you are letting them win because you are afraid. I'm afraid of losing you," Caleb roared. "If I push too hard, the law comes down on me. I have a record. Eliza, they're waiting for me to slip. One mistake, one bullet, and they take everything. The land, the house. You." He turned away, leaning his hands on the mantel, his head hanging low. "I'm trying to keep us alive," he whispered. "Alive?" Eliza asked, her voice breaking. "Is this alive? Caleb? We are ghosts in this house. We do not talk. We do not touch. We are just waiting for the next disaster." She turned and walked into the bedroom, slamming the door. That night, the silence in the bed was deafening. They lay back to back, the cold space between them stretching out like a canyon. Eliza stared at the wall, feeling abandoned, feeling that the man she married, the fighter, had been broken. Caleb stared at the window, feeling the crushing weight of his own impotence, knowing that his caution looked like cowardice, but knowing that his rage would be suicide. Outside, the wild land lay indifferent under the stars. It did not care about their grief. It did not care about justice. It simply waited, vast and hard, for them to either break or survive. Summer fell upon the Wyoming territory not as a season, but as a punishment. After the violence of the thaw, the rain simply stopped, and the sky bleached out to a blinding, colorless white. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the valley until the air shimmered and danced above the baked earth. The grass, which had briefly turned green in May, was yellow and brittle by July, snapping underfoot like dry bones. The creek, usually a rushing lifeline, had receded to a sluggish, muddy trickle that smelled of wet copper and rotting vegetation. Survival became a daily, grinding negotiation with the sun. Caleb and Eliza moved through their chores with a sluggish economy of motion, conserving sweat. The silence between them, born of grief and the bitter argument after the miscarriage, had not lifted. It hung in the house like the dust, settling in the corners, coating their tongues. They worked side by side, passed dishes at the table, and lay in the same bed, but they were like two islands separated by a receding tide. One blistering afternoon, a shadow fell across the porch. Eliza was shelling peas into a tin bowl, her fingers moving mechanically. She looked up to see a man standing by the water trough. He was thin, his clothes hanging off him like scarecrow rags, and his boots were worn through to the leather uppers. He held a battered hat in his hands, twisting the brim. "Water, ma'am," he croaked. His voice was like grinding stones. Eliza stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course." She drew a dipper of cool water from the pump and brought it to him. He drank it in one long, desperate pull, the water streaming down his dust-caked beard. "Thank you," he gasped, handing the dipper back. "Name is Jedediah." "Just passing through. You look like you have walked a long way." "Jedediah," Eliza said, "sit. I have coffee on the stove. It is hot, but it is strong." The man hesitated, then sank onto the edge of the porch as if his strings had been cut. Eliza brought him a mug of coffee and a leftover biscuit. He ate with the frantic speed of a stray dog. Caleb rode in 10 minutes later, his horse lathered despite the slow pace. He tied the gelding to the rail and eyed the stranger with suspicion. "Who are you?" Caleb asked, his hand resting near his hip. "Just a traveler," the man said, standing up quickly. "Jedediah, your wife was kind enough to spare a biscuit." Caleb nodded once, stiffly. "Where are you headed?" "West," Jedediah said, looking away. "Anywhere the railroad is not—" Caleb's eyes narrowed. "You worked for the line?" "Surveyor," the man muttered. 5 years. Laid the track from Omaha to Cheyenne. But I am done. The work. It is not honest anymore." Eliza, who had been watching the man's face, stepped forward. "What do you mean, not honest?" Jedediah looked at her, then at Caleb. He lowered his voice, though there was no one to hear them but the heat-struck cattle. "I saw the new maps," he said, "the ones the Union Pacific commissioned last month. They are redrawing the lines, moving boundaries, marking settled land as disputed or open range." Caleb went very still. "My land," Jedediah shrugged. "I saw a lot of maps, but I know this valley. They have marked the water rights on this creek as unclaimed. They say the original deeds were irregularly filed." "Irregularly filed," Caleb repeated, the words tasting of ash. "They are looking for leverage," Jedediah warned, putting his hat back on. "If they can prove a deed is shaky, or if the owner has no heirs or a bad reputation, they just take it. It is easier to steal it with a pen than a gun." He tipped his hat to Eliza. "Thank you for the coffee. Ma'am, watch your back." He walked away down the dusty track, a harbinger of doom dissolving into the heat haze. That evening, the tension in the house was electric. Caleb paced the floorboards groaning under his boots. "I have to go to town," he said finally. "I have to talk to Finch. He will only lie to you," Eliza said from her chair by the window. She was mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "I need to know where I stand," Caleb snapped. "If they are messing with the deed, I need to look him in the eye and see it." He rode out the next morning at dawn. Eliza watched him go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. When Caleb walked into the bank in Iron Ridge, the air was cool and smelled of expensive paper and stale cigar smoke. Silas Finch sat behind a large mahogany desk, looking entirely too comfortable for a man who was orchestrating the theft of a valley. "Mr. Rourke," Finch said, not rising. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I want to see the county map," Caleb said, leaning his knuckles on the desk. "And I want to know why a surveyor says my water rights are marked as unclaimed." Finch smiled, a smooth, practiced expression that did not reach his eyes. "Ah, rumors, Caleb. The frontier is full of them. Is my deed valid?" "Silas," Caleb demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Finch sighed, picking up a pen and twirling it. "That is a complex question. You see, there has been some concern. A concerned citizen raised a point regarding the dates on your father's original filing. It seems the date of the signature corresponds to the week of the Great Blizzard, the week your family died." He looked up, his eyes glittering with malice. "The argument is that your father, God rest his soul, was under extreme duress, freezing, perhaps not of sound mind. And since he died before he could personally file the papers at the land office, well, it leaves a door open." "You are saying my father was mad?" Caleb growled. "I am saying that a court might find the transfer of title to you ambiguous, especially given your own history of instability. Violence runs in the blood, they say." Caleb lunged across the desk, grabbing Finch by his lapels. The banker squeaked, dropping his pen. "My father paid for that land in gold," Caleb roared, "and I have held it for 6 years. "Assault!" Finch shrieked. "Sheriff!" The door to the office burst open. The sheriff, a heavy man with sweat stains under his arms, stood there with his hand on his gun. "Let him go." "Rourke," the sheriff ordered, Caleb shoved Finch back into his chair. He straightened his coat, breathing hard. "This is not over," Caleb spat. Finch adjusted his tie, his face red but triumphant. "Get out of my bank and enjoy the ranch while you can. Rourke, progress is coming." While Caleb was fighting the battle of the law, Eliza was fighting a war of whispers. She had gone to the Chinese laundry to pick up Caleb's Sunday shirt. The laundress, a kind Irish woman named Mrs. O'Malley, who had married into the business, looked at Eliza with sad eyes as she wrapped the parcel. "You should not be in town today, dear Mrs. O'Malley said softly. "The talk is vicious." "What are they saying now?" Eliza asked. "Weary to her bones. That I am a witch? That I caused the drought?" Mrs. O'Malley hesitated, then leaned over the counter. "They are saying you lost the baby because of your past." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" "They say, the older women, the church biddies, they say it was a judgment, that a woman who has lain with men out of wedlock cannot carry a decent man's child. They say your womb is cursed by sin, and what?" Eliza whispered, her hands gripping the counter. "And that you ride like a man because you refuse to be a wife, that you are driving Caleb to ruin because you are unnatural." Eliza walked out of the laundry into the blinding sun. She felt sick, a physical nausea that roiled in her gut. But beneath the sickness, the spark that had been kindled at the creek, the rage, flared into a white-hot flame. They were attacking from both sides. Finch was using the law to question Caleb's sanity and title. The town was using gossip to question Eliza's morality and fitness. It was a coordinated effort to isolate them, to break their spirits so they would simply pack up and leave. She drove the buggy home in a fury, the wheels kicking up clouds of dust. When she arrived, Caleb was already there, sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. He looked defeated. "They are going to take it. Eliza," he said without looking up. "They claim the deed was never properly filed because of the storm. They say my father was crazy when he signed it." Eliza sat beside him. She told him what Mrs. O'Malley had said. She told him about the whispers that her sins had killed their child. Caleb looked at her, and the defeat in his eyes turned to a dark, simmering anger. But it was a helpless anger. "We have no proof. The courthouse burned down 4 years ago with the county records. All we have is the copy in the safe, and Finch says it is a forgery." 2 days later, a rider from the nearest post station dropped a letter in their mailbox. It was addressed to Caleb Rourke, son of Jeremiah. The handwriting was shaky and old. Caleb opened it at the kitchen table. Eliza watched him read, saw his eyes widen. "It is from Samuel Goodwin," Caleb said. "He was a lawyer in Cheyenne. He knew my father." He read aloud. "Dear Mr. Rourke, I have heard of the troubles regarding land claims in your valley. I am old now, and my memory fades, but I remember your father well. He was a meticulous man. Before he left Cheyenne for the last time, before that terrible winter, he had a deed drawn up here, in my office. He witnessed it, and I witnessed it. He took the original and a set of letters proving his payment in full. He carried them in a metal strongbox. He told me he intended to bury the box under the floorboards of the homestead for safekeeping until he could buy a safe. If the local records are gone, that box is your proof." Caleb lowered the letter. "The homestead? The ruins?" Eliza asked. Caleb nodded. "The old cabin, up in the high pass, where they died." He looked pale. He had not been back to that spot since the day the bodies were brought down. It was a place of ghosts. "We have to go," Eliza said. Caleb shook his head. "It has been 6 years. The cabin burned a year after they died. Lightning. There is nothing left but ash and rot." "The letter says he buried it under the floorboards," Eliza insisted. "Metal survives fire. Caleb, if that box is there, it proves everything. It proves your father was sane. It proves the land is ours." Caleb looked at her, fear warring with desperation in his eyes. "It is a hard ride, Eliza, steep, and you are still healing." "I can ride," she said firmly, "and I'm going with you. We do this together." They set out at first light. The heat was already rising, but as they climbed higher into the foothills, the air grew thinner and cooler. The trail was treacherous, a narrow ribbon of loose shale clinging to the side of the mountain. Caleb rode the bay gelding, his posture rigid. Every turn of the trail, every rock formation, seemed to drag a memory out of him. Eliza rode the mare behind him, watching his back. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept one hand near the horn of his saddle as if bracing for a blow. They reached the ruins just after noon. It was a desolate place. The stone chimney stood like a tombstone against the sky. The rest of the cabin was a blackened scar on the earth, a jumble of charred beams and collapsed walls, half buried in 6 years of scrub growth and dirt. Caleb dismounted. He stood looking at the wreckage, his breathing shallow. "This is where I left them," he whispered. "I said I would come back." Eliza dismounted and went to him. She took his hand. "You did come back. Caleb, you are here now." She led him toward the ruin. "Where was the main room?" "There." Caleb pointed to a depression in the earth, near the chimney. They began to dig. They had brought shovels, but the space was too tight, cluttered with debris. They used their hands, pulling away charred wood and stones. The soot coated their skin, turning them black. The dust clogged their throats. For an hour, they found nothing but rusted nails and broken glass. Caleb's movements grew frantic. He was tearing at the earth, sweat streaking the soot on his face. "It is not here," he shouted, throwing a piece of wood aside. "It is gone, just like them. Keep digging," Eliza commanded, dropping to her knees beside him. Her fingers brushed something hard and smooth. "Not stone, Caleb." She clawed at the dirt. It was a corner, a rusted, iron corner. Together, they scrabbled at the earth until they freed it. It was a metal strongbox. The lock rusted shut, the surface pitted and scarred by fire, but intact. Caleb lifted it out. It was heavy. He sat back on his heels, holding the box in his lap. He stared at it as if it were a holy relic. "Open it," Eliza whispered. Caleb took a pry bar from his saddlebag. He jammed it under the lid. The rusted metal groaned, then gave way with a screech. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that was brittle and flaking, was a sheaf of papers. Caleb unfolded them with trembling fingers. The edges were singed, and the paper was yellowed, but the ink was black and clear. Deed of title, paid in full. Jeremiah Rourke, and beneath it, a letter in his father's hand. "My dear son Caleb, this land is for you and Samuel. Keep it safe." Caleb let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He pressed the papers to his forehead, rocking back and forth. "He did it." Caleb choked out. "He saved us, even from the grave." Eliza wrapped her arms around him, laying her head on his soot-stained shoulder. Her own tears cut tracks through the dust on her face. They sat there in the ruins of the tragedy that had defined Caleb's life, holding the promise of a future. "We have them," Eliza said fiercely. "Now let's go finish this." The ride back to town was grueling, but they moved with a new purpose. They rode straight to Iron Ridge, bypassing the ranch. They needed to register the deed immediately, before Finch could invent a new lie. They arrived in town just as the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the street. They rode to the sheriff's office. Caleb dismounted, the strongbox under his arm. Eliza slid down beside him. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the door to the office opened. The sheriff stepped out, followed by 2 deputies and Silas Finch. "There he is," Finch said, pointing a manicured finger. "Caleb Rourke," the sheriff said, his hand resting on his holster. "You are under arrest." "For what?" Caleb demanded, stepping in front of Eliza. "Trespassing," the sheriff said. "Assaulting a prominent citizen, and suspicion of fraud." "Fraud," Caleb shouted. "I have the proof right here." He lifted the box. "That is evidence," the sheriff said, snatching the box from Caleb's surprised grip. He handed the box to Finch, who took it with a smirk. "Secure the prisoner," the sheriff ordered. The deputies moved in. They grabbed Caleb's arms. "No!" Eliza screamed. "You cannot do this! He has the deed!" Caleb struggled. but he was exhausted from the ride and outnumbered. They slammed him against the wall of the building. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed in the street. Townspeople were gathering, drawn by the commotion. They whispered behind their hands. "Violence is in his blood," a woman murmured. "I told you," he finally snapped. "Maybe the land is better off with the bank." A man agreed. "Respectable management?" Caleb looked at Eliza as they dragged him toward the cells. His eyes were desperate. "Eliza!" he shouted. "Don't let them take it. Get the lawyer." And then the heavy door slammed shut, cutting him off. Eliza stood alone on the boardwalk. The sheriff and Finch had disappeared inside with the box. The townspeople stared at her, the soiled dove, the ruined woman, the wife of a criminal. She felt a moment of crushing despair. They had won. They had the land. They had Caleb. And they had the proof. No, she thought. No. She turned and walked away. She did not run. She walked with her head high, the soot on her face like war paint. She went to the small, dusty office of Mr. Abernathy, the only other lawyer in town. He was a man who drank too much and slept in his suits, but he hated Silas Finch. She pounded on his door until he opened it, bleary-eyed. "Mrs. Rourke?" he asked, blinking. "My husband has been arrested," Eliza said, her voice hard as flint. "And Silas Finch has stolen our deed. I need you to represent us." Abernathy rubbed his face. "Finch owns the judge." "Ma'am, Judge Holloway rides circuit. He likes fine whiskey and easy verdicts. I do not care what he likes," Eliza said. "I care about the truth. Will you help me?" Abernathy looked at her, at the dirt on her clothes, the fire in her eyes. He sighed, then stepped back. "Come in, Mrs. Rourke. Tell me everything." For the next 2 days, while Caleb sat in a stifling cell, Eliza Rourke became a ghost haunting Iron Ridge. She visited the Chinese laborers' camp down by the tracks. She found Chen, a quiet man who had worked on the survey crew. He was terrified, but Eliza sat with him for hours, speaking gently, until he agreed to write a statement about the redrawn maps. She went to Mrs. O'Malley at the laundry. "I need you to testify." Eliza said, "Oh, dear, I cannot." "Mrs. O'Malley said, wringing her hands. "My husband." "You heard the women." Eliza said, "You heard them plotting to spread the rumors. You heard them say they wanted to drive us out. That is conspiracy." "Mrs. O'Malley, it shows malice. Please, for the truth." "Mrs." O'Malley looked at Eliza's desperate face and nodded slowly. Eliza tracked down Jedediah, the drifter. He was camped by the river, ready to move on. She bribed him with her wedding ring, the only thing of value she had left, to stay one more day and speak to the judge about what he saw in the map room. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was a furnace. The windows were open, but the air was still and thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and dust. Flies buzzed lazily against the glass. Every seat was taken. The town had turned out for the show. Caleb was brought in. He looked gaunt, his face bruised. He had not shaved in 3 days. When he saw Eliza, his eyes lit up with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She took her seat behind him. She wore her plainest dress, washed and pressed. Her hair was pulled back severely. She looked like what she was, a woman holding on by a thread. Judge Holloway sat behind the bench, wiping his bald head with a handkerchief. He looked bored. Silas Finch's lawyer, a slick man named Sterling from Cheyenne, began his opening. He painted a picture of Caleb as a dangerous, unstable loner, a man who had forged documents and attacked a pillar of the community. He painted Eliza as a woman of questionable morals, whose testimony was as reliable as a shifting sand dune. When it was the defense's turn, Mr. Abernathy stood up. He was rumpled, but sober. "I call Eliza Rourke to the stand." A murmur went through the crowd. Eliza stood up. Her legs trembled, but she forced them to move. She walked to the witness chair and sat down. "Mrs. Rourke," Abernathy said, "tell the court about the deed." Eliza took a breath. She looked at Caleb. Then she looked at the judge. "My husband is not a liar," she began, her voice low, "and he is not a thief. We found the original deed buried in the ruins of his father's cabin. We dug it out of the earth with our bare hands." "Objection," Sterling drawled. "We have not seen this alleged deed. The sheriff says the box contained only old letters." "That is a lie," Eliza said, her voice rising. "Sheriff, you took the box. You gave it to Mr. Finch." The sheriff stared at the ceiling. "I recall a box of trash." "Ma'am." Eliza turned back to the judge. She stood up. "Your Honor," she said, "they are trying to steal our land. They cut our fences. They set fire to our barn." She pointed to the back of the room, where the two cowhands from the Triple Bar were sitting, smirking. "Those men there, I heard them laughing about it. Order!" The judge banged his gavel. "I will not be silent," Eliza cried. She turned to face the town. "You look at me and you see a scandal," she said, her voice ringing out in the hot room. "You whisper that I am ruined, that I lost my child because I am a sinner." The room went deadly silent. "I lost my child because I was terrified," she said, tears standing in her eyes but not falling, "because I was run off the road by a storm while trying to defend my name against your vicious gossip." She looked at Mrs. Gable. She looked at the shopkeeper's wife. "You destroyed me back east with lies," she said, "and you are trying to do it again here. But I am not that girl anymore. I am a rancher's wife. I have ridden through blizzards. I have worked the soil. I have dug through the ashes of the dead to find the truth." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was the letter from Samuel Goodwin, the old lawyer. She had kept it on her person, hidden. When the sheriff took the box, "This is a letter from the man who drew up the deed," she said, holding it up. "It describes the box. It describes the papers. And it proves that Silas Finch is a liar." She walked to the bench and slammed the letter down in front of the judge. "Read it," she challenged him. The judge looked at the letter. He looked at Silas Finch, whose face had gone a pale, sickly color. He looked at the townspeople, who were shifting in their seats, shame beginning to replace the gloating on many faces. Caleb watched his wife. His heart felt like it was breaking in his chest, expanding with a pride so fierce it hurt. She was magnificent. She was a storm in her own right. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. He picked up the letter. He read it slowly. This presents a complication," he muttered. He looked at the sheriff. "Where is the box, Sheriff?" "In evidence." "Your Honor," the sheriff mumbled. "Produce it," the judge ordered. "Tomorrow morning, unopened, or rather, in its current state." He looked at Eliza, then at Caleb. "This court is adjourned until tomorrow at 9 o'clock, the judge announced, "and I suggest, Mr. Finch, that you ensure that strongbox is exactly as this witness described it." He banged the gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Eliza stood there, swaying slightly. Caleb stood up and reached over the railing. He caught her hand. "Eliza," he whispered. She looked at him, exhausted but triumphant. "We are not done yet," she said. The judge had postponed the decision, afraid of the banker but cornered by the truth. But as Eliza walked out of the courtroom, head high, the crowd parted for her. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was the silence of respect. That night, the town of Iron Ridge did not sleep. The heat of the day had settled into the dust of the streets, radiating upward in suffocating waves. But the air hummed with something more volatile than temperature. In the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. The piano was silent, the player having abandoned his stool to listen to the arguments breaking out at the bar. Men slapped coins down on the sticky wood, silver dollars and worn eagles, placing bets on a man's life as if it were a horse race. "He is done for," a cattleman from the north spat, counting out his wager. "Finch has the judge in his pocket. Rourke will be lucky if he does not hang for assaulting a banker." "I don't know," a younger hand countered, nursing a whiskey. "Did you see his wife? The way she stood up there? That was not the talk of a crazy woman. She had papers. Papers can be forged," the cattleman sneered. "The land is gone. Rourke is a dead man walking." At the boarding house down the street, the atmosphere was quieter but no less charged. In the parlor, women sat with their needlepoint, their voices lowered to a harsh whisper. They dissected Eliza's appearance in court, her plain dress, her lack of a hat, the soot that had still been faintly visible on her neck. To speak so boldly, Mrs. Gable sniffed, stabbing her needle into the hoop. In front of the men, it is unseemly. A decent woman would have let the lawyer speak, or perhaps a decent woman fights for her home, a quiet voice said. The women turned. It was the laundress, Mrs. O'Malley, who had delivered clean sheets earlier and lingered. She dug that box out of the ground with her bare hands. Mrs. O'Malley said, facing them down. I saw her hands. They were bleeding. That is not shame. Mrs. Gable, that is grit. Silence descended on the parlor, uncomfortable and heavy. High above the street, in a small, stifling room rented above Mr. Abernathy's law office, Eliza Rourke lay awake. The heat was oppressive, trapping the smell of old paper and dust in the narrow space. She stared at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, her body exhausted but her mind racing like a runaway team. She replayed every moment of the hearing. Had she spoken too loudly? Had she sounded hysterical? Had the judge believed her? Or had he just been looking for a way to delay the inevitable? She turned on her side, pulling her knees to her chest. The ache of the child she had lost throbbed in her chest, a phantom pain that felt more acute in the darkness. She imagined what it would have been like to have a baby sleeping beside her now, a small, warm weight to anchor her against the storm. Instead, she was alone, her husband in a cell, her home under siege. She closed her eyes, picturing Caleb. She saw him not as the prisoner in irons, but as the man who had ridden into the blizzard to find her. Hold on, she whispered into the dark. Just hold on until morning. 3 streets away, in the town jail. Caleb Rourke sat on the edge of a narrow cot. The cell was a stone box, cooler than the outside air, but smelling of damp earth and despair. A single barred window let in a square of moonlight that crawled slowly across the floor. Caleb did not sleep. He sat with his hands clasped between his knees, staring at the stone wall. He thought of his father, Jeremiah. He remembered the old man's laugh, the way he would look out over the valley and say, "This is it, Caleb, this is the kingdom." He thought of his mother's gentle hands and his brother Samuel's bright, eager face. They were ghosts now, part of the soil he was fighting to keep. For years, their memory had been a weight, a source of guilt that nearly crushed him. But tonight, thinking of the rusted box and the letter, the weight felt different. It felt like armor. They had not left him with nothing. They had left him the truth. And then his mind turned to Eliza. He saw her face as she stood before the judge, pale, fierce, terrifyingly beautiful in her anger. He had brought her here to be a housekeeper, a shield against gossip. He had not expected her to become the steel spine of his life. He realized, with a jolt that settled deep in his gut, that he was more afraid of failing her than he was of losing the land. If they took the ranch, he could survive. He could work. But if he lost the look he had seen in her eyes, that mixture of fear and defiant hope, he would truly be a pauper. Dawn arrived with a deceptive softness, painting the sky in shades of pearl and lavender. The heat had not yet risen, and the town lay quiet for a brief, breathless hour. A knock came to the door of Eliza's room. She sat up, her heart hammering. Had the verdict come early? Had something happened to Caleb? She smoothed her dress, which she had slept in, and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was an older woman. She was dressed in expensive dark silk, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were tired, surrounded by a web of fine lines that spoke of sleepless nights. "Mrs. Rourke?" the woman asked. "Yes, I am Martha Holloway, the judge's wife." Eliza stiffened, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "Mrs. Holloway, we are due in court in 2 hours." "I know," the woman said. "May I come in?" Eliza stepped back, allowing the woman to enter the cramped, airless room. "Mrs." Holloway looked around at the peeling wallpaper and the narrow cot, her expression unreadable. "I will not stay long." "Mrs." Holloway said, turning to face Eliza. "My husband is a stubborn man, Mrs." Rourke. And he is a man who likes his comforts. Silas Finch ensures those comforts are met. Eliza said nothing. She felt a cold dread pooling in her stomach. Was this a warning? A dismissal? But, Mrs. Holloway continued, her voice softening, he is not a monster. She walked to the small window, looking out at the waking town. We had a son, she said quietly. Years ago, before we came west, he died of a fever when he was 6. Eliza felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. She stepped closer. I am so sorry. When you spoke yesterday, Mrs. Holloway said, turning back. You spoke of losing your child. You spoke of the fear. I saw my husband's face. He remembered. The older woman looked at Eliza, her gaze direct and piercing. Silas Finch is a powerful man. He can make life very difficult for a circuit judge. But there are things more powerful than money. A sin against the dead. Stealing a man's inheritance by mocking his family's tragedy. That is a heavy thing to carry before God. She reached out and briefly, awkwardly, touched Eliza's arm. I cannot promise you the outcome. My dear, the law is a tangled thing, but do not lose hope. My husband slept poorly last night. And when a man sleeps poorly, it is usually because his conscience is waking up. She turned and left as quietly as she had come, leaving Eliza standing in the dawn light, her heart beating with a new, fragile rhythm. By 9 o'clock, the courtroom was packed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. The air was already stifling, smelling of sweat and tobacco. When the bailiff called, "All rise," the room went silent. Judge Holloway walked in. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he moved with a heaviness that had not been there the day before. He sat down, arranging his robes, and looked out over the court. He looked at Silas Finch, who sat with his lawyer, smug and polished. He looked at Caleb, who stood in the prisoner's dock, haggard but unbowed. And he looked at Eliza, who sat behind her husband, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The judge picked up a piece of paper. I have reviewed the evidence presented yesterday, Judge Holloway began, his voice gravelly, and I have examined the contents of the strongbox, which the sheriff finally saw fit to produce this morning. He glared at the sheriff, who shifted uncomfortably against the wall. The documents within are old, damaged by fire and time. However, the judge continued, lifting his head, they are legible. The deed is signed, witnessed, and dated. The accompanying letters from the bank in Cheyenne confirm a withdrawal of funds corresponding to the purchase price. Silas Finch stood up. Your Honor, this is preposterous. Those papers are clearly forgeries planted by— Sit down, Mr. Finch, the judge roared, slamming his gavel. Finch sat, his mouth snapping shut. The court finds, the judge said, lowering his voice to a steely calm, that the title to the Rourke claim is valid. The land belongs to Caleb Rourke, by right of inheritance and purchase. A gasp rippled through the room. Furthermore, the judge continued, regarding the charges against Mr. Rourke, the charge of trespassing is dismissed, as a man cannot trespass on his own land. The charge of assault? Well, given the provocation and the questionable nature of the foreclosure attempt, I find that Mr. Rourke acted in defense of his property. Charges dismissed. Caleb let out a breath, a long, shuddering sound that seemed to empty his lungs. One final matter, the judge said, fixing his eyes on the banker. Mr. Finch, I have heard disturbing testimony regarding cut fences, arson, and intimidation. Let me be clear. If one more fence is cut, if one more fire is set, if Mr. Rourke or his wife are harassed in any way, I will not look for a culprit. I will look at you, and I will bring the full weight of the territorial court down upon this bank. Do I make myself clear? Finch was pale, his hands gripping the table. Crystal, Your Honor, case closed. The judge banged the gavel and stood up, sweeping out of the room without a backward glance. For a second, there was silence. Then, the room erupted. The sheriff moved to the dock, looking sullen. He unlocked the cuffs on Caleb's wrists. The metal clattered to the floor. Caleb rubbed his wrists, wincing as the blood rushed back. He did not look at the sheriff. He did not look at the crowd. He turned slowly to face the gallery. Eliza was standing there. She was trembling, tears streaming silently down her face. They stared at each other across the railing. The distance was only a few feet, but it felt like miles, miles of grief, of silence, of the walls they had built to protect themselves from the pain of their loss. Then, Caleb moved. He vaulted over the low railing, ignoring the gasp of the crowd. He crossed the space in 2 strides. Eliza! He pulled her into him. It was a collision. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tightly her feet almost left the floor. Eliza clung to him, gripping his coat, sobbing into his chest. They did not care that the town was watching. They did not care that Finch was glaring at them with hatred. They held on to each other with a desperate, shaking fierceness. 2 survivors clinging to the only wreckage that mattered. "We did it," Caleb whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "We did it." They walked out of the courthouse 10 minutes later, into the blinding glare of the mid-morning sun. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, vast and indifferent. They stopped on the bottom step. The crowd was dispersing, people casting curious, almost respectful glances at them as they passed. Eliza took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. "I was afraid," she said, looking out at the dusty street. "Of the trial?" Caleb asked. "No, of you." She turned to him. "I was afraid you would hate me for standing up there, for telling them everything. My past, the baby. I dragged our pain out into the street for everyone to see. I thought you would never forgive me for exposing us like that." Caleb looked at her, shocked. He reached out and took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "Eliza, look at me." She met his eyes. They were dark and warm, stripped of all the shadows that had haunted them for months. "I was afraid too," he confessed. "I was afraid I had asked too much of you. I brought you to this hard, violent place. I tied you to a man with a target on his back. I thought I was destroying you, that I was selfish to want you here when all I could offer was danger and scorn." He leaned his forehead against hers. "I am sorry," he whispered. "Not for loving you, but for shutting you out, for letting the grief build a wall between us. I thought I was protecting you by staying silent. I was wrong. I was wrong too," Eliza said, her voice trembling. "I thought I had to be strong alone. I thought my pain was a burden you did not want. We were fools," Caleb said, a small, wet laugh escaping him. "Yes," Eliza smiled, leaning into his touch. "We were—" They stood there for a long moment, the sun warm on their faces. The apology was simple, halting, but it carried the weight of the blizzards, the fires, and the long, cold nights. It was the foundation of something new. "Let's go home," Caleb said. The return to the ranch was not a parade. It was a slow, quiet ride. When they arrived, the signs of the struggle were still there. A fence post near the road had been smashed, likely by a frustrated heavy boot on the way out of town. In the distance, they heard the crack of a rifle, a warning shot from a poacher or a disgruntled neighbor, a reminder that not everyone was happy with the verdict. But there were other signs, too. As they rode up to the main gate, they saw that the hinge, which had been hanging loose for weeks, had been repaired with fresh wire. A neighbor, likely old man Miller from the next valley, must have stopped by, and on the porch, sitting in the shade, was a burlap sack. Caleb dismounted and checked it. It was winter wheat seed, high quality. There was no note. "Change comes slow," Caleb said, running his hand over the rough burlap. "But it comes." Summer mellowed into autumn. The brutal white heat gave way to a golden, hazy light that turned the valley into a bowl of amber. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brilliant, trembling yellow. They threw themselves into the work of rebuilding, but it was different now. It was shared. They spent days hauling rocks to reinforce the eroded creek bank, working shoulder to shoulder in the cooling mud. They patched the roof of the barn, Caleb hammering while Eliza passed him the shingles. Inside the house, small things changed. Caleb brought home a rocking chair from town one day, setting it by the fire without a word. Eliza built a rough shelf for her few books, reclaiming a corner of the room for her mind. Caleb replaced the latch on the door with a sturdy iron bolt, not to keep people out, but to keep the peace in. Their intimacy deepened with the season. The frantic need of the storm and the awkward silence of the grief were gone. Nights by the fire became a time of quiet talking, of whispered dreams. They touched more, a hand on a shoulder while pouring coffee, a brush of fingers passing the reins. Each touch was colored by the knowledge of how close they had come to losing it all. Eliza initiated these moments more often now. She would come up behind him while he washed at the basin and wrap her arms around his waist, resting her cheek on his back. She did it not just because she wanted him, but because she needed to claim this life. She needed to feel the reality of him. Caleb learned to stand still in these moments, to let go of the fear that wanting too much would invite disaster. He learned that her strength did not make him weak. One evening, as the first frost threatened the air, they sat by the fire. "Do you think—" Eliza began, then stopped. She looked at the flames. "Do you think we will be blessed again? With a child?" Caleb stopped whittling. He looked at her, seeing the lingering shadow of sorrow in her eyes, but also the tentative light of hope. "I do not know," he answered honestly. "The doctor said it might be hard." Eliza pulled her shawl tighter. "I want to hope, but I am afraid. What if I can't? What if I am not enough?" Caleb set the wood down. He moved his chair closer and took her hands. "Eliza, listen to me." He waited until she looked at him. "If we have children, I will thank God every day. But if we do not, if it is just you and me in this house until we are old and gray, then I will still thank God. You are enough. You are everything. It is us against the world, remember?" Eliza squeezed his hands, tears pricking her eyes. Us against the world. A week later, the evening was crisp, the air smelling of pine resin and coming snow. The sun was sinking behind the granite hills, painting the sky in aggressive strokes of dusty gold, violet, and rose. Caleb came into the house. "Put your boots on," he said. "Why?" "I want to show you something." He had saddled the horses, the bay gelding for himself and the roan mare for her, but he had put the western saddle on the mare. Eliza swung up into the seat. She did not need help anymore. She settled into the leather, adjusting her stirrups with the ease of a woman who had spent months in the saddle. She wore her worn trousers and her canvas coat, her hair tied back in a loose braid. They rode away from the house, up a deer trail that climbed the steep ridge behind the barn. It was a rough path, rocky and narrow, but Eliza rode with confidence, her body moving in rhythm with the mare, trusting the animal, trusting herself. The wind tugged at her hair, cold and clean. They reached the top of the ridge as the sun touched the horizon. Caleb pulled up. "Look!" Eliza stopped beside him. The view was staggering. The entire ranch was spread out below them like a quilt. She could see the house, small and gray, with smoke curling from the chimney. She could see the barn, the crisscrossing lines of the fences they had repaired, the dark dots of the cattle grazing on the autumn grass. She could see the creek, glinting like a vein of silver in the dying light. It was rough. It was scarred. But it was precious. Eliza's throat tightened. She took it all in, the vastness, the silence, the sheer scale of the land that had tried to break them and failed. She turned to Caleb. He was watching her, his face illuminated by the golden light, a quiet pride in his eyes. She laughed, a breathless sound that was snatched away by the wind. "I thought I would never ride again," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "After we lost the baby, after the fire, I thought I was done. I thought I would never feel anything good again." She looked down at her hands on the reins, then back at him. "I have never ridden like this, Caleb. Not until you married me. Not until all of this." Caleb looked at her. He saw the woman she had become, forged in the fires of scandal and survival. He saw the partner who had dug up his father's legacy, I used to think this land had taken everything from me, he said, his voice rough. My parents, my brother, my name. I hated it. Eliza. I fought it every day. He reached out and covered her hand with his own. But now I see that it gave me you. Eliza turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. Their gloves were worn, their grip strong. Our love was not made in a parlor, Caleb said softly. It was forged in storms, in dirt, in blood and tears. That is why it will hold. They sat there for a long time, knees touching, horses blowing softly in the cooling air. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of shared strength, of desire, of a deep, abiding peace. As the sun finally dipped below the peaks and the first stars began to prick the vast, darkening dome of the sky, Caleb turned his horse. Ready? Eliza nodded. Ready. They rode back down the ridge together, side by side. They rode into the gathering dark, toward the small light of their home. The future was still uncertain. The winter would be hard. The world would be cruel. But they were two scarred souls who had claimed each other in this wild, unforgiving land. And as they disappeared into the shadows of the valley, they knew they would survive, and they would love fiercely, no matter what came. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust, the snow, and the heartbreak of the American frontier, and I hope Eliza and Caleb's story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience and romance, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories from the rugged edge of history. I invite you to share your thoughts, your favorite moments, or what this story meant to you in the comments section. Until next time, keep riding.